Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, the summer session 2019. Introduction to World Philosophy is our book, and this video is going over Friedrich Nietzsche, the human all too human, and the cheerful science, which is more commonly known as the gay science. So we will be going over the final exam questions for exam 3. So it'll be part A, number 7. How is Nietzsche's critique of the metaphysical world in Aphorism Number 9 in Human All Too Human similar to Berkeley's critique of matter? And then for that's actually part B. That's the 100-word essay option. And then for part A, the 250-word option is compare Nietzsche's The Cheerful Science to Plato's Pheadrus, the Taittiriya Upanishad, and the Katha Upanishad. Keep the idea of the horizon of the cosmos in mind. So I'll briefly explain both of the basic answers for those first. And then I'll go in and look at excerpts from Human All Too Human and the Cheerful Science, or the Gay Science. And that'll cover what you need to know for the exam. And then after that, I will give a little more context for Nietzsche's theories, because he's different than all of the other philosophers that we've gone over, with the exception of Plato. So Plato, he wrote in dialogue form, and therefore you can never be absolutely sure what Plato himself believed, because he's just expressing the beliefs of Socrates and the people that he's talking to. So there's a lot of theories. Oh, he didn't mean what he said, and so at any rate. Similarly with Nietzsche, he likes to write about wearing masks and lying. So I'll read the introductory notes. His philosophy is sometimes called Perspectivism. Everything is just a perspective. And it seems like Nietzsche plays with different perspectives, and he'll flip-flop all the time. And that's what makes it difficult to summarize his books. So again, I'll first go over the straightforward surface reading, which you'll be responsible for on the exam if you choose to cover Nietzsche. And then I'll put it in some context and show you how his ideas kind of go in circles. And to give just a preface of what I'll be saying, we saw in Hegel said it's the sequence of evolution of philosophical concepts that is fixed. The dynamic process of history that moves the cultural mind from one philosophical worldview to the next, to the next. Each of those worldviews is fixed in a certain series leading towards knowledge of the absolute. So what I'm going to argue that Nietzsche, I'll point out sections of his different books where he points out that that sequence of philosophical concepts works in a circle. And he calls that circle the vicious circle God. So if that's what he really believes, then the atheistic philosophy that he preaches in most of his books, with the exception of The Birth of Tragedy, his first book, it was not an atheistic book. He talked about Dionysus, the Greek god. But you could see what he's doing is articulating different phases of this historical progression of concepts that go in this circle, starting with, well, and he points out himself, the Hindu philosophy of the Brahmins 4,000 years ago, where they believed in Vishnu, as we've been going over the Upanishads. And then it rejects itself in the form of Buddhism. But if it's really a circle, it would indicate it's coming back to this theological cosmology, which is consistent with some of the things Nietzsche says about his god Dionysus. Okay, so now I will go over briefly the summary of the answers for exam 3. So compare Nietzsche's The Cheerful Science to Plato's Pheadrus, the Taittiriya Upanishad, and the Katha Upanishad. Keep the idea of the horizon of the cosmos in mind. So in The Cheerful Science, Nietzsche talks about, he says his most famous phrase, God is dead. So I think, therefore I am. Cogito, ergo sum. That's René Descartes. That's the most famous philosophical saying, except for maybe Nietzsche's God is dead. That might be equally famous. If not, it's a close second. And he says it in The Gay Science, number 108. I'll just read it here. New struggles. This is page 501 of our book. After Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, shiver-inducing shadow. God is dead. But given humans as they are, there may be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow is shown, and we still have to defeat his shadow! Exclamation point. So Nietzsche likes to use exclamation points. You can imagine him yelling when he's giving his prophetic exclamations. But again, what does Nietzsche himself really believe? That is definitely up to question. So then the next section in our book is aphorism number 124, and it is in the horizon of the infinite. And the image he uses is wiping away the horizon. I'll get into that. If you look at the Madman, aphorism number 125, he says, how were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the whole horizon? What did we do when we loosed this earth from its sun? So when we murdered God, he's saying, we wiped away the whole horizon. So in these previous videos, I've been showing that, according to Plato, in the Pheadrus, the absolute ideas, which St. Augustine later called the ideas of God's mind, exist specifically at the outermost horizon of the cosmos, which is very similar to holographic string theory, as I've been pointing out. So Nietzsche here is saying, we killed God. How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the whole horizon? That you can see in the context of the Pheadrus and the Upanishads, which Nietzsche was familiar with both. He was very familiar with Plato and the Upanishads. He liked the philosophy of the ancient Brahmins. He talked about them and Plato as the beginnings of philosophy in the East and the West. So I'll go then read selections from the Pheadrus and the Upanishads, where they talk about the horizon and the ideas of God. So that's just the brief introduction. That could get you going. If you wanted to do that, you could read it yourself, but I will be going over it. So the part B question is, how is Nietzsche's critique of the metaphysical world in Human All Too Human similar to Berkeley's critique of matter? So in Human All Too Human, aphorism number 9 is on page 499 of our book. It's called Metaphysical World. It's on the bottom of the right-hand column. And he's just basically saying Kant's idea of the thing in itself. In the previous video, we went over Hegel, and then prior to that, we went over Kant. He is saying that, Nietzsche's saying that's a useless idea. Even if it was a real thing, since we have no way of accessing it, since all we can ever experience is phenomena, the world as it appears to us after having been filtered through the categories of thought, space, time, and causality, the main ones. So Kant says, we have no way of knowing the thing in itself. The very claim to try to know it is absurd and self-contradictory, because to know it is to alter it, and then it wouldn't be itself. So it would be conditioned by our own cognitive processes. So is there a thing in itself? Nietzsche's saying, well, I'll grant you it's possible, but even if it exists, it's the most useless of all realizations, he says on page 500 up at the top on the left. And that is what Berkeley says on page 470 about the concept of matter. So Berkeley is an empiricist, and he says all that exists are ideas in the minds that perceive them. Nothing exists. There is no such thing as unthinking substance existing outside of the mind. Because you're assuming that our ideas are reflections or like photographs of something existing outside of our mind. He didn't think about photographs, but representations of objects that exist in themselves outside of our mind. He goes, how is that possible? How can you prove it? If all we know is our ideas, then how do we know they reflect something that isn't represented by our ideas? He's saying it's an unnecessary addition to what we actually experience, and we can get along in the world just fine if we understand the so-called physical objects that we see as just ideas in our mind. And then he said, what's the difference between our own private ideas in our minds that no one can know about and the apparently stable physical objects that we can all perceive. He says those are the ideas in God's mind. But all that ever could possibly exist are ideas in the minds that perceive him. And even if there is such a thing as matter, says Berkeley, it's a useless postulate. It might exist. There's no way we could prove it. We don't even need it. When we dream, we see a whole world as if there was physical objects, but they're just ideas in our mind. So that's the basic answer for that. All right, so I've gone over the basic answers. You've got enough, I think, with just that to develop your answers for the exam. And now I'll give a little more context to Nietzsche's philosophy. So again, he is probably the most, not probably, he's the most popular philosopher today. If you go on, for example, I gave this summer class last summer with our other book, 4 Fundamental Questions, and I went through the chapters just like this, and so other people can see them on YouTube. The 2 most popular ones were the videos on Nietzsche. I mean, this is just a community college class, but by far that drew the most interest. And because he's pretty interesting, he's a pretty interesting philosopher and very tricky to get a hold of. So let me give you the straightforward analysis, beginning with the introductory remarks on page 496. So German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, a fierce critic of Christianity, also rejected much of traditional philosophy, including its style. His works are, for the most part, pastiches of aphorisms, standalone paragraphs, and brief essays. Arguments often emerge only over the course of a work or even several works. So that's an important point to keep in mind. You have to read what he said in one book and put it in the context of the same imagery that he's used in previous books, which I'll give a little taste of after I go through the exam questions again in a more straightforward way. So then continuing here, Nietzsche's father and grandfathers were Lutheran pastors. One grandfather was a noted scholar of Christianity, but his father and younger brother died when Nietzsche was only 4, and then he had chest injuries when he was thrown from a horse at age 23. He served as a nurse in the Franco-Prussian War, where he contrived dysentery. He got very sick. He was a prodigy in philology, which is the study of languages, how they develop. And so he studied the classical literature, and that's an important point to keep in mind. He mentions it in Human Alto Human Philology in Aphorism Number 8. But he was recognized as a genius very young, and it says here he became a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland at 24, but had to resign at 35 because of his failing health. He spent the last 11 years of his life incapacitated by mental illness. So that is also interesting. I'm going to give a lot more detail of the background for understanding Nietzsche after this straightforward analysis, but one contextual point I think is important at the outset to have in mind is here is his friend Paul Deussen, who became the topmost Sanskrit philologist, who studied the ancient Hindu language of Sanskrit in which the Vedic literatures were written, was Nietzsche's close friend. And here's what Paul Deussen said about their confirmation. So they were Lutherans. So our confirmation together on Later Sunday of the year 1861, I don't even know what that word is, so Nietzsche was 17, set a new bond between us. As the confirmants walked to the altar in pairs to receive the consecration on their knees, Nietzsche and I, as closest friends, knelt side by side. I still remember very well the holy, ecstatic mood that filled us during the week before and after confirmation. We would have been quite ready to die immediately to be with Christ, and all our thoughts, feelings, and actions were irradiated with a super-terrestrial joy, which, however, as an artificially grown little plant, could not last, and under the pressure of studying and living very soon vanished just as quickly as it had come. So Nietzsche was the son of a Lutheran pastor, Both of his grandfathers were Lutheran pastors. Some of his uncles were also. He lived in kind of a caste of pastors, so theologians. And this is why he had an affinity for the Brahmins of ancient India. He romanticized them. He also saw them, a shadow side, so he wasn't the kind of a philosopher who looked away from a shadow side. That was one of the things he's famous for, showing the underside, the dark side of reality. But at any rate, he's famous for saying God is dead. He wrote a book called The Antichrist. He attacks Christianity, but he rarely attacks Jesus himself. And many Christians enjoy reading Nietzsche's books and find that it bolsters their Christian faith. And we saw at age 17, he was quite ready to die for Jesus Christ. But then Paul Deussen said, oh, but our mystical attitude vanished like a little plant. Well, it didn't vanish for Nietzsche. And he criticized Deussen for being a kind of a shallow philosopher, a great Sanskrit philologist, but he wasn't so up on Paul Deussen's more or less atheistic interpretation of the Hindu texts, which you would think is strange since Nietzsche said God is dead. But so when we get to the Cheerful Science where he's proclaiming that God is dead, he's not happy about the fact that God is dead. For Nietzsche, he did believe in God. And then for him, that was what was most important in life, as it was for his whole family. But then it seems he lost his faith in God under a historical analysis of the origins of Christianity as a philologist. Oh, this is how the scriptures, they lead back here through the Zoroastrian texts and into the Hindu texts. And what's unique about, this is supposed to be divine revelation. It looks like a historical progression, that an accretion of different myths over eight, so he became an atheist. But did he come back to a belief in God? Some people think he did, and he gives all sorts of tantalizing little hints about such a possibility. So that's just something to keep in mind when we're going through the book here. So now continuing here in the introductory notes, Nietzsche's unusual style, this is page 496, and hostility to philosophical system building make it difficult to summarize his thought. Some of his themes, especially his attack on Kant's thing in themselves and his version of relativism, often known as Perspectivism, appear in a relatively early book, Human All Too Human. So that's what we'll be going over. His most characteristic theses emerge in the works of his middle period, Beyond Good and Evil, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, The Genealogy of Morals, and The Cheerful Science, usually translated The Gay Science or Joyful Wisdom. The last is famous for Nietzsche's pronouncement that God is dead. So that's what we'll also be going over. To understand what Nietzsche meant by the startling proclamation, contrast Nietzsche's position with that of Hegel. Hegel tells the story of spirit progressing through stages, coming to self-consciousness, and ultimately realizing absolute knowledge, which they say it's tempting to identify with God. And that absolute knowledge is a unity with the mind of God. That is certainly what Plato indicates, as well as the Christian theologians like St. Augustine. And the mind of God is specifically at the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where the past, the present, and future are experienced simultaneously. So Nietzsche rejects not only the existence of God as defended by Christianity and other religions, but also an absolute and the possibility of absolute knowledge in any sense. He embraces Hegel's historicism. Our thought is indeed relative to the particular historical epoch in which we find ourselves, but he rejects Hegel's identification of constant dynamic principles governing the unfolding of human thought. That's the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's the dynamic principle, the dialectical principle of history that Hegel says that's constant. Not the a priori categories of space-time and causality. Those might evolve and change from one epoch to another, but the dialectical process of I'm claiming this, you claim the opposite, and then someone synthesizes the two, that is constant, says Hegel. And here in these introductory notes, they're saying Nietzsche rejected that even the dialectical process was an absolute, eternal, fixed law of nature. So then continuing here, the progression of human thought, Nietzsche contends, is not reducible to principles of logic or rationality, dynamic or otherwise. Indeed, it is to a large extent irrational, driven by a will to power and other factors. There is no reason to expect that it will reach some ideal fixed point of complete knowledge. In fact, there is no reason to expect it to progress at all. Human thought sometimes advances, sometimes retreats, sometimes bogs down, and sometimes detours. Well, I'll point out where Nietzsche does say that there is a very definite fixed pattern of philosophical progress, and that pattern is the circle. As a spoiler alert, it's Beyond Good and Evil number 20 says it very clearly, that all the philosophers of history fall into a very definite fixed sequence, which is determined by the logic of the grammar of the language that they use, he'll say. But at any rate, this idea of the cyclical progress of the philosophical concepts through history, that is a point that Nietzsche makes. So he doesn't think it's just a random chaos. He implies things like that occasionally, but ultimately his idea is this eternal return is one of his most famous concepts. Every single detail that you've ever experienced will happen again after an enormous span of time that repeats itself in every detail. So the cyclical progress of history is a pattern for Nietzsche that I'll address. But getting now into human all too human, so I'm just going to do that one first because it comes first in our reading. So that's part B, question 7. I'm trying to get here without turning off our... All right, good. So question 7, part B. How is Nietzsche's critique of the metaphysical world in Aphorism Number 9 in Human All Too Human similar to Berkeley's critique of matter? So page 499, here's what Nietzsche says. Metaphysical world, that's the title of the aphorism. It is true, there could be a metaphysical world. The absolute possibility of it can hardly be resisted. We regard all things by means of the human head and cannot cut it off. The question remains, nevertheless, what of the world would still be there if one had cut it off? All right, so what he's saying, he's talking about the a priori categories of thought. The space and time are the categories of thought that frame our sensations, and then cause and effect is the main category of thought that helps us link those sensations together in a meaningful way. And Kant said, we can't know the thing in itself because all we can know is what's been filtered to us through our a priori categories of thought. So that's what Nietzsche's talking about. We can't cut off the head, so what would the world be like when our head is cut off, when we're not perceiving it through these categories of thought? So he says, the question remains, nevertheless, what if the world would still be there if one had cut it off? This is a purely scientific problem and not very likely to worry people. But everything so far that has made metaphysical assumptions valuable, frightful, delightful, is passion, error, and self-deception. The worst methods of attaining knowledge, not the very best, have taught us to believe in them. That means the idea of another world beyond our senses. If one uncovers these methods as the foundation of all existing religions and metaphysical systems, one disproves them. The possibility still remains, but one can do nothing at all with it, let alone base happiness, welfare, and life on the spider thread of such a possibility. So the spider thread, I think, is important to keep in mind because according to the Hindus and Plato, the absolute ideas at the outermost horizon, the ideas of God's mind, are connected to us down here by a thread of destiny. It's what Plato called it in The End of the Republic, in the myth of the near-death experience. And the Hindus call it akshara. In one of the Upanishads, I'm trying to remember which one, but they talk about the ether is woven with the past, present, and future, and then there's this spiritual thread that links from the outermost ether to the internal spheres of the universe with Earth in the middle of this hollow cavity. So at any rate, the spider thread of such a possibility, he might have been thinking along those lines because he was certainly aware of that history. So he says the possibility still remains, means there might be a metaphysical world, but one can do nothing at all with it, let alone base happiness, welfare, and life on the spider thread of such a possibility. One could assert nothing at all about the metaphysical world except as other, as another world, inaccessible, incomprehensible to us. It would be a thing with negative characteristics. If the existence of such a world were well proven, then knowledge of it would nevertheless stand firmly as the most useless of all realizations, more useless than knowledge of the chemical analysis of water would be to the sailor in the midst of a storm. Okay, so maybe there is a metaphysical world. We can't prove that there isn't. But even if it exists, it's useless to us because it's inaccessible to us. So that is very similar to what Berkeley said about matter on page 470 of our book. Let me go over there. Berkeley says in the dialogue between Hylas and Philonous, Philonous is representing Berkeley's own philosophy, and Hylas is representing John Locke's philosophy that there are primary and secondary qualities of matter. We only know the secondary qualities, which are taste and color. There's subjective opinions. What tastes sweet to you is bitter to someone else. What's red to you might look gray to a dog or someone who's colorblind. So those are just created by the primary qualities interacting with our own subjective faculties. The primary qualities are extension in space, shape, and there's other ones, but the main one is extension, substance extended in space, this unthinking substance extended in space. That's a primary quality of matter. It has extension. Is it large or small? That's your subjective opinion, but it is extended in space. And it's there outside of your mind. That's the theory. That's John Locke's empiricism. And Berkeley says, how could you prove that there's unthinking substance extended in space outside of your perceptions of it? It's impossible to prove, and there's no reason why you should even think that it is there. We experience ideas in our mind, the sensations of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Why do you want to add a whole nother world of unthinking matter outside of our empirical experience? It's unnecessary. It's useless. Maybe there is. I can't prove there isn't some mystical idea of an unthinking substance you call matter outside of our minds, but there's no reason that it doesn't help our philosophy, and there's no way to prove it. So I'll just read here. Page 470. Philonous says, my aim is only to learn from you the way to come at the knowledge of material beings. Whatever we perceive is perceived immediately or mediately by sense, which is immediate. I see it, I touch it, I taste it. Or by reason and reflection. Oh, I remember something and now, so that's mediated by your memory. There's the thing that happened and there's your memory of it, and that's so. But as you have excluded sense, pray show me what reason you have to believe their existence, or what medium can you possibly make use of to prove it, either to mine or your own understanding. How do you admit you can't perceive matter with your senses? All you perceive with your senses are sense perceptions, and they don't exist in matter. The primary qualities of matter don't reflect our sense perceptions. So you can't perceive matter, you only perceive sense perceptions. So then you must understand it's there by using some sort of a rational theory. So explain that theory to me. Here's what Hylas says. To deal ingeniously, Philonous, now I consider the point. I do not find I can give you any good reason for it. But thus much seems pretty plain that it is at least possible such things may really exist, and as long as there is no absurdity in supposing them, I am resolved to believe as I did till you bring good reasons to the contrary. Philonous says, what? With an exclamation point. Sounds like Nietzsche. Is it come to this, that you only believe the existence of material objects and that your belief is founded barely on the possibility of its being true? Then you will have me bring reasons against it. Though another would think it reasonable, the proof should lie on him who holds the affirmative. All right, so there is the basic material to work with if that's going to be the exam question that you use on exam 3. So going now to part A, question 5. Compare Nietzsche's The Cheerful Science to Plato's Pheadrus, the Taittiriya Upanishad, and the Katha Upanishad. Keep the idea of the horizon of the cosmos in mind. All right, so The Cheerful Science. I already read Aphorism Number 108, where he says, after Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous shiver-inducing shadow. God is dead, but given humans as they are, there may be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow is shown, and we still have to defeat his shadow. So I don't want to disturb my neighbors too much reading Nietzsche with all of the exclamation points that he has. So there's the preface, and then we skip to Aphorism 124, and then to Aphorism 125. So I might as well just read through most of it to give you an idea of what he's getting at. But the main thing, so Aphorism number 124 is in the horizon of the infinite. So remember, in the Pheadrus, Plato says the absolute ideas, the idea of goodness, the idea of the good, which contains all of the other ideas, the idea of justice and beauty and courage, as well as the idea of tree and rabbit and water and everything you can experience through your senses is a reflection of some absolute idea. We saw that in Plato's different dialogues, the Republic, but here we're comparing it to the Pheadrus. Those ideas, the sources of reality, the unchanging, simple forms of being exist at the outermost horizon of the cosmos. Nietzsche would have been aware of that. He read Plato's dialogues in the original Greek. He didn't read Sanskrit very well, but his friend Paul Dussain did, and he read the translations of the Upanishads. He knew about the ether. So if God is dead, that means the horizon of the cosmos is not God's mind. So how did we wipe away the whole horizon? He was thinking almost certainly in terms of that ancient philosophy of God. It was the Christian. St. Augustine carried it forward. So did Dante. So that's what we're going to keep in mind here. So I'll just read. I might skip a sentence or two, but I'm going to just keep flowing on Aphorism 124 and 125. So 124 is in the horizon of the infinite. He says, we have left the land and gone to sea. We have burned. So every single sentence has an exclamation point. So I'm going to just give a little emphasis. We have left the land and gone to sea. We have burned the bridge behind us. Even more, we have destroyed the land behind us. Now, ship, look out, look ahead. Beside you lies the ocean. To be sure, it does not always roar, and every now and then it lies there like silk and gold and a fantasy of grace, but hours will come when you will recognize that it is infinite and that there is nothing more terrible than infinity. Oh, the poor bird that felt free and now pushes against the walls of this cage. Woe if homesickness for the land strikes you, as if there would have been more liberty there, and there is no longer any land. So you get homesick for the land. There is no longer any land. That's it, the horizon of the infinite. We've left the land behind us. I'm interpreting that to mean there is no ground of being. So the horizon of the infinite, ironically, is the ground of being in Plato's philosophy. But if you don't believe in God and the ideas of God's mind, then there's nothing. You're going to be left floating in an empty, meaningless space without any way of knowing what's up, what's down. Everything is morally relative. All knowledge is impossible if there is no God. That's the land. The land has disappeared. There's only now an ocean of possibilities, which is reminiscent, I think, or not reminiscent, more foreshadowing quantum mechanics, the worldview inspired by quantum physics. And Nietzsche will talk about physics and how it changes our philosophy, and we should let it. So now, Aphorism number 125, the Madman. I want to make sure that this camera is still going. So now, the madman, all right, I'm just going to read here. A madman comes to tell everyone God is dead, and they're astonished to hear it. Some don't believe in God, and they mock him. Others do believe in God, and they escort him out of the church. So the madman. Have you not heard of that madman who, I'm screaming already because I'm just preparing. So have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning, ran to the market, and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As there were many who stood together there who did not believe in God, he excited much laughter. Is he lost? Said one. Did he wander off like a child? Said another. Or does he keep himself hidden? Is he afraid of us? Did he go to sea, emigrate? In such a way they laughed and yelled in disorder. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his gaze. Where is God? He cried. I will tell you. We killed him, you and I. We all are his murderers. But how did we do it? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the whole horizon? So there's the key quote for exam question 5 in part A. What did we do when we loosed this earth from its sun? Where does it move now? Where do we move? Away from all suns? Don't we continually fall? And backwards, sideways, forward, in all directions? Is there still such a thing as up or down? Don't we wander as through an infinite nothing? Don't we feel the breath of empty space? Didn't it become colder? Doesn't night follow night? Don't lanterns have to be lit in the morning? Do we still hear nothing of the noise of the grave diggers who bury God? Do we still smell nothing from the divine decay? For God's to decay, God is dead. God remains dead, and we killed him. How can we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? The holiest and most powerful one the world possessed bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? With what water could we clean ourselves? What ceremonies of atonement, what holy games must we invent? Isn't the size of this deed too large for us? Don't we have to become gods just to appear worthy of it? Okay, so now he's bringing in this idea of the Übermensch, which he makes famous in his next book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There is no God. The only way to endure that fact is to become a kind of God-man. So he'll go on to say, there was never a larger deed, and whoever is born after us will belong to a higher history than all history so far. Here the madman fell silent and gazed at his listeners again. They too were silent and looked at him in astonishment. Finally he threw his lantern on the ground. It broke into pieces and went out. I come too early, he said. It is not yet time. This tremendous course of events is still on its way. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds require time, even after they are done, in order to be seen and heard. This deed is more distant than the furthest stars, and yet they have done it themselves. So again, the horizon of the cosmos is where the most distant stars exist. And I'll bring in here at this point the history of physics, which Nietzsche was talking about in Human All Too Human and in all of his books, has led us full circle back to this idea of the omniscient horizon of the cosmos. That the past, the present, and the future, according to holographic string theory, which unites general relativity and quantum mechanics, they're all interwoven at the point, the spherical point from our perspective on Earth, where space is expanding at the speed of light. Everything's recorded there and then radiates in with the echo of the Big Bang on these little one-dimensional threads, like the spider threads that Nietzsche talks about in Human All Too Human, where we read earlier, to create this holographic illusion of three-dimensional objects unfolding through history. So Nietzsche's bringing it up. The deed is more distant than the furthest stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It takes time for light to travel. It travels at this absolute speed of light, but it still would take, 13.7 or 13.8 billion years ago is when the Big Bang occurred. So, light out from the Big Bang that's expanding outward, that's how long it would take for it to get back to us. But at any rate, my main point here is Nietzsche is making us think of the horizon of the cosmos, which he introduced us to in Aphorism 124, in the horizon of the infinite. So God is the horizon, and that's why he talked about wiping away the horizon with a sponge. But here he's bringing up the idea of we killed God, and he's identifying that act with the most distant, furthest stars. And it takes time for this deed to be known. So I'm just going to finish off here on page 502. It is said that the madman that same day forced his way into different churches and therein intoned his requiem aeternum Deo, eternal rest to God. Let out and called to account, he answered in each case, what are these churches if they are not the tombs and crypts of God? Okay, so now we will compare that to the pertinent sections of the Pheadrus, and that would be back on page, I believe, 2. I don't want to, all right. So page 257 from Plato's The Pheadrus. So Socrates he's talking about life after death, in between reincarnations. Here's what happens. The reincarnating souls, they follow one or the other of the demigods. And then, so he says, but when they go to banquet and festival, he's talking about the demigods. But when they go to banquet and festival, then they move up the steep to the top of the vault of heaven. The chariots of the gods, in even poise, obeying the rein, glide rapidly. But the others labor, for the vicious steed goes heavily, weighing down the charioteer to the earth. So that was the metaphor of there's two winged horses pulling a chariot. And the soul is in the chariot, but you've got your sense desires as one rebellious horse, and the other one is your passion, which obeys the intellect and tries to force the wayward sense desires in line with the intellectual goal, but almost inevitably the sense desires win out and pull the soul back down earthward, away from the horizon of the cosmos. So this is the hour of agony and extremest conflict for the soul. For the immortals, when they are at the end of their course, go forth and stand upon the outside of heaven. The revolution of the spheres carries them round, and they behold the things beyond. But of the heaven which is above the heavens, what earthly poet ever did or ever will sing worthily? I'll describe it, for I must dare to speak the truth when truth is my theme. There abides the very being with which true knowledge is concerned, the colorless, formless, intangible essence, visible only to mind, the pilot of the soul. The divine intelligence. All right, so when the soul can get you out to the heaven of heavens, outside the horizon of the cosmos, that's where your horses can feast on the absolute ideas. Beholding, knowledge absolute, in existence absolute. In the revolution, she beholds justice and temperance and knowledge absolute, not in the form of generation or of relation which men call existence, but knowledge absolute in existence absolute. Beholding the other true existences in like manner and feasting upon them, she passes down into the interior of the heavens and returns home. So on the right-hand column on page 258, he says, but the soul, which has never seen the truth, will not pass into the human form. So you have to see these absolute forms to become a human being. That's what differentiates us from the animals. That's what reason is. The ability to connect the sense perceptions to their absolute ideas at the horizon of the cosmos. So, for a man must have intelligence of universals and be able to proceed from the many particulars of sense to one conception of reason. That's the absolute forms of knowledge. This is the recollection of those things which our soul once saw while following God, when regardless of what we now call being, she raised her head up towards the true being. And therefore the mind of the philosopher alone has wings. This is just, for he is always, according to the measure of his abilities, clinging in recollection to those things in which God abides. In beholding them, he is what he is, and he who employs aright these memories is ever being initiated into perfect mysteries, and alone becomes truly perfect. But, as he forgets earthly interests and is wrapped in the divine, the vulgar deem him mad and rebuke him. They do not see that he is inspired. So the madman makes allusions to this idea of the horizon of the cosmos being the place where God's ideas exist. God created the universe. When God creates a tree, he refers to his idea of the perfect tree. All of the different pine trees, oak trees, maple trees, and every other tree are all like fractal fragments of the absolute tree, which contains all of those. They all radiate from God's idea of tree, which exists interwoven with all the other ideas at the outermost horizon of the cosmos. The whole ensemble of absolute ideas, the spherical container of the cosmos, and the central point, we learn in the dialogue called the Timaeus, that would be the idea of the good. It contains all of the other absolute ideas. So in the gay science, number 124, number 125, Nietzsche's saying, how did we what sponge did we have to wipe away the horizon? How can you erase the mind of God? Do you understand what this means? There's now no longer any ground of being. There are no moral absolutes by which to guide our behavior. Now we have to become like God because God is dead. So that is the comparison to